Okay, welcome back, everyone. This is our second panel, and the title for this panel is Vegan Spatialities of Domescrated Animals. So again, the theme for this conference is on space and time. So while the last panel was definitely about time, veganism over time, this was definitely about how do we negotiate space with non-human animals. And the first talk by Federica is going to be on being locked up. I assume, is that about being actually locked up in prison, or is this COVID? Is this COVID? Okay.
COVID.
No. Okay. I was gonna say, I thought it was about COVID. Just want to make sure. And then the other one we're talking about the housing crisis with Zoei. So we had someone, unfortunately, who's not able to join us for the talk today. So that does leave a lot of extra space. So there's less pressure on the speakers to squeeze it in 20 minutes. But also that means we'll have extra time for question and answers. And I think what I'll do then is have question and answers after each talk, because if we can do that, that's always best practice, because if we wait to the end, then it's usually the last person who presents who gets all the questions. So I'll try to, we'll break it up. But just a quick reminder, if you want to leave your comments and questions in the chat box, I will monitor those. And also, if you want to live tweet about us, please hashtag IAVS 2022, and please tag Vegan Sociology. And as people are speaking throughout the day, if you leave your handle in the chat, I'll be sure to tag you for promotional purposes. So without further ado, Federica, my good colleague, if you're ready.
Yes.
Sweet. Take it away.
Can you see the screen? Okay. Can you hear me?
All good.
Okay. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna presenting on a study that I did during the first total lockdown that was decreed the 9th of March 2020 in Italy, around 3 weeks after the first Italian patient has been diagnosed with COVID-19. My presentation draws on a qualitative study, and it comprises a bunch of interviews, 34 online interviews with a total of 39 respondents. The interviewees lived at least with one non-human household member, reside in Italy at the moment of the interview, and all the conversations took place from home, mine and theirs. Italy was the first country hit by the pandemic in the West and would reach 100 deaths per million inhabitants at the end of March 2020. This lockdown lasted until mid-May, with some easings, drastically limiting mobility and social contact. A little bit of theoretical background, but really a minimum. Describing the epidemic space, Jos van Loon affirms that infection is association. Social actors are always involved in multiple implicatedness, as he calls it, where order is produced and reproduced. Contagion foregrounds how societies organize around their material and symbolic boundaries, keeping infection and its unexpected emergencies at bay. Whereas contagion doesn't necessarily involve a risk, as for instance, Araway's notion of transfection shows, but can be either a vital or a lethal phenomenon. During environmental and health crises, social actors become more aware of the porosity and vulnerability of contact zones. In a pandemic situation, boundaries need to be secured around the self and also around one's home, one's nation, the whole globe. In this context, speciesism is among the symbolic and material means employed to contrast contagion and secure boundaries. In fact, relying on the distinction among species as if it were given, speciesism already defines neat boundaries that are carefully ordered, measured, and distributed into hierarchies of value and apparatuses of power. The COVID-19 pandemic funnels, performs, and highlights all this. This emergency situation gave me an opportunity to investigate how ideological and material thresholds in and throughout interspecies relations are differently activated and signified depending on one's positionality in the pandemic space. Considering contagion as a natural cultural ecosystemic phenomenon through the lens of the species, but using a multi-optic approach, according to Claire Jenkins' definition, my analysis follows the intersecting lines that cross-cut, enact many of the dichotomies on which speciesism rests. Interspecies relations and their distinctions, as experienced and narrated by my respondents, differently mobilize such lines, which never stand still, nor are the same for everyone. Inside and outside, private and public, domestic and foreign, near and distant, visible and invisible, known and unknown. So I wonder, what happens to the symbolic and material rooms of speciesism when they are caught in the biocultural geography of infection of a zoonotic pandemic? How intra and interspecies relationships perform and traverse such rooms, and how are they performed and affected in such secured and at the same time highly risky places? Although my discussion guide for the interview included 4 sections in which I assessed my respondents' relations with non-human animals in lockdown in terms of space, activities, effects, and mediated imaginaries, I will only focus on space today, although all planes are clearly interrelated, and in particular on these 2 aspects: interspecies relations at home and interspecies relation from home. Home is where humans in Western cities more often come in close contact with non-human animals, and it is also a highly fetishized place. I'm following, for example, Anna Singh here, who talked about this, talking about women at the tropics and the way they fetishized, space was fetishized as a place of purity against germs and external intrusions. Some of the findings of my research show that companion animals do not merely fill existing space-times, they actively build them and define their material symbolic boundaries, which stretch beyond the present to include the paths of memory, for instance, family memories and imagination. For those living with them, they are usually defined as a necessity of inhabiting a house, a permanent presence, or even a genius loci, and also an added value. Ordinarily, on a material plane, the organization of the domestic space always considers their needs. Openings are arranged in such a way as not to let them out or as to allow them to come back safely. Windows, balconies, roofs, and terraces are secured with nets and other protections, and cut flaps, window screens, special stairs, bridges are built or mounted for them. The inside-outside distinction variously implies safety and risk, depending on how human and non-human bodies are positioned, mobilized, and affect. Some example here. For example, from the urban space, INT 30 and INT 31, for instance, decided to share their dog with their grandchildren twice a week, as the dog was the only point of contact between the 2 families during the mobility restriction. In 27, living with a hypochondriac partner was no longer allowed to walk the dog in lockdown. He only took him up to the roof where they would spend the morning relaxing and exercising. In 27th, partner in fact feared that the dog could carry the virus under his paws and constantly cleaned them with disinfectant. At the time of our conversation, though, INT 27 had just decided to stand up against these impositions and had obtained to walk the dog, although on a leash and accompanied by his partner, who want to check, and I quote, if we walked properly, if we were careful, unquote. In the countryside, 2 other examples. For animals with special needs, solutions are devised when vets cannot be consulted due to the restrictions of lockdown. Talking about one of their companion cats in 36 and 37, tell that they have planted a stake in their garden so that the cat on a leash can go around safely, because having had a near infection that left him with balance problems, letting him walk around on his own without supervision wasn't very safe. Int 18 was able to leave the city and move to a countryside house with her partner, her son, and their 2 indoor cats. Even if their cats were eventually allowed to go out and meet the local feral cats, she noticed that they tended to keep their habits, preferring the, and I quote, more humanized, civilized, anthropomorphized, unquote, open space of the roof. Home thus can be experienced both for humans and companion animals as a safe place, familiar, non-contaminated, as a shelter, and as a risky and abusive place, as a place of freedom, but also as a place of isolation. See, for instance, what we said about Int 27, whose hypochondriac partner's very harsh regime of limitation had become even stricter during lockdown for him and his dog. On the contrary, in 14, a political refugee who has been living in Italy for many years was living with his dog in a tent when the lockdown was announced, and a friend let him stay in a house. He finds it difficult to get accustomed to their new protected condition, unlike C, the dog, who likes it very much. In 21, whose mother stayed with her for some time during lockdown, felt suffocated by her presence to the point of having a panic attack, and was also crushed by the weight of her mother's reproductive labor. By the way, the decision to keep her foster dog eventually gave her a more comforting, quote, sense of responsibility, unquote, and control over family space in lockdown. What seems common to most experience actually is that in forced proximity and heightened vulnerability, home becomes a place of intensified reproductive labor, rewarding as well as burdening, both human and non-human, with all the contradiction this entails. Of course, non-human care is more visible in lockdown cohabitation, however, only by paying attention to it, it is possible to actually see how it works. This has to do with paying attention to companion animals. However, 2 different patterns emerge from my research, which involve not only companion animals, but are nonetheless mediated by interspecies relations at home. My respondents paid a lot of attention to their companion animals. However, they also observed them at home while also observing other animals from home. As Donna Haraway explains, paying attention means becoming with as companion species, quote, to hold in regard, to respond, to look back reciprocally, to notice. It implies an effective and embodied involvement and acknowledging the differences in behavior and agency of companion animals, such as their capacity to develop their own relation. Significantly, for example, 2 respondents also problematized the dominance in interspecies relations and foregrounded the issue of consent. Observation excludes the possibility of an encounter and maintains a duality, where animality is opposed to humanity and remains on the side of nature. By quote Nicole Shukin here, splitting apart relationships and knowledges, unquote. Observation ultimately substantiates speciesism and ignores its material and symbolic systems of oppression. When and where species don't meet, to paraphrase Paul Arcari, interspecies vital contagion cannot take place. Through companion animals at home, my respondents also rediscovered the otherness of nature and enjoyed its spectacular beauty. Nature was perceived as a realm of freedom from social constraints, a spatial elsewhere that is also a nostalgic before, a wilderness at hand that civilized humans have lost. Observing companion animals so closely was, quote, a very formative observation, like a live documentary, unquote. Int 18, for instance, found it, quote, very amusing, unquote, to look at its, quote, wonderful contamination, unquote, between her cats and the feral cats going around the country house, which, however, never actually took place. Non-companion animals were observed through liminal zones that regulated interspecies relations and inside-outside passages. What reenchantment perspectives tend to exclude are highly commodified and instrumentalized animals, made invisible by the normalization of the processes in which they are caught. Some natures are idealized, whereas, quote, other natures are still slaughtered, bred, traded, confined, raised, tested on, put to work, abused, and killed, unquote. Polarcari again here. An example of reenchantment is the one that you can read in this slide. A statement made by the respondent number 32 that I think you all read now. So observation, and I'm going to conclude, observation creates distinctions and also relies on specific tropes. Overall, the invasive native species trope, which is a scientific fallacy based on the assumption that ecosystems are closed and stable, of course, in the context of the pandemic, I could notice that it is accompanied by that of the infective epiphanic species. In the first trope, so the invasive native species trope, dangerous outsider animals are opposed to animals that have always been with us and are part of our world. The second trope, so the infective epiphanic one, opposes two kinds of outside, one menacing, one wondrous, both of which treat nature, the realm of unbounded forces, as separate from culture, very much bounded in pandemic conditions. This is quite evident in the above mentioned account of IN32, that about the cows, who sketches a moving trompe-l'oeil of what is actually at stake. Which animals are invisibilized by these intersecting visibilities? The answer is not difficult, since the narratives about invasive animals to be contained and epiphanic animals to be admired overlook the exploitative relations of production and reproduction of global capitalism. The same trick, for example, is at play in the opposition between proper and improper meat production and consumption, as, for example, Marek Müller also underlines in the essay about carnistic colonialism. So the biopower exercised on farmed animals was almost never perceived as primary cause in the discourses of individuals and the media, which often followed a prevention, control, anthropocentric approach. Talking about the post-pandemic future, for example, it is interesting to note that only 4 respondents have mentioned factory farming in 39 interviews, in a total of 39. So 4 respondents have mentioned factory farming as a problem, but only 1, a self-defined vegan and anti-speciesist, advanced anti-speciesist arguments. 4 respondents, though 2 of which were vegan, drawing on the issue of shared vulnerability in the COVID-19 pandemic, talked about being locked in a cage and what this entails. So my hope is that if social and species inequalities are undoubtedly intensified by the pandemic, they also provide an opportunity to rethink what it means to be embedded in such radically altered ecologies. Recognizing that our relations with the lives with which we are entangled, the boundaries that we set or trespass, as well as the mobility allowed, can make contagion vital or lethal, both for us humans and for multi-species life. Thank you. If you're interested in the whole study, it is forthcoming in a book edited by Erika Catward, Ruth McKee, and Victor Guas next December, I hope. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Federica. Like I said, I would like to open this up for questions now while it's still fresh in people's mind. We got a good group of folks in the audience here. Bukhara says, thank you for your presentation, your study. Roger says, thank you. Does anyone have any comments or questions on that? I saw a hand. Track it down. Hold on.
I think it was
Zoe
mine.
does. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, I might have missed this, but I'm really interested when you were talking to people about their lives with their companion animals during the pandemic. Did you notice many species differences in the companion animals? Like, did you talk to people who had free living
Well,
birds?
actually, not many. Mostly, I have, of course, enlisted them. Mostly dogs, cats, and something else, maybe, but mostly dogs and cats. Yeah.
Okay. Did people walk their cats during the pandemic?
They try to, not my respondents actually, not massively at least, but they try to in order to go out. So they use the cats as instruments in order to take a walk. Yeah, but of course there was a situation of also reciprocal observation, so that when you like worked out, try to go out without a proper motive, people, I wouldn't say denounced you, but there was diffuse, I know, it wasn't very nice because you felt observed, and there was a lot of police in the streets. So for example, I took a walk by the sea because I live by the sea. It's like 200 meters from my house, and I had to go back because they said that wasn't a necessary walk. I wasn't without my cats though.
Okay. I do have one more question if there aren't any others, but I don't want to hog question time.
Let's say go on ahead.
My last question was when people were talking about living in the homes with their animals, and I know you mentioned kind of opportunities for extra visibility and being able to observe animals. Did anyone talk about arriving at a different way of relating to the animals in their homes? Did they sort of say, you know, I spent all this time locked up with my cat and now we've rearranged the house?
What I noticed is that they not only did things with the animals, so in terms of activities, for example, they learned to pay attention in a different way to them and enter in a more physical relation, and sometimes also a sort of exchange of perception. So they started with things like their animals, not only for them and with them. Yes, this is a recurrent pattern. What is fun is, for example.
So I see Alex's hand up.
Yeah, before Alex formulates his question, what is fun is that they were extremely preoccupied for their companion animals in terms of health. For example, not being able to go into the vet as before, not being able to properly take care of them in terms of, for example, buying food, shortage of pet food, but all of them said that it was impossible that their dogs and cats could be carriers of the virus. Even though, of course, this is scientifically proven, especially for felines. And there were cases in Italy, and there were communication about this, but all of them said that it was crap, that media, that it was fake news, that animals couldn't be, companion animals couldn't be virus carriers. They could be infected, but they could infect in turn, which of course is really strange.
Thank you, Federica. That was fantastic, and I very much enjoyed listening to it. I feel like that resonated very much with my experience as well during lockdown. I don't live with anymore, but my dad built a ramp for my childhood dog over lockdown as like sort of a project, and that was because he started to notice more so that she was struggling to go up the stairs, and I wonder if that would have ever had happened if people hadn't been stuck inside. My question there was more to do with the shapes of the places that these people called home. I was wondering if there were any differences between participants, whether they were coming from apartments or more expansive homes, depending on how they viewed animals. Did that shape how they saw animals?
Yeah, it surely influences their relations, because I mostly, from my respondents mostly lived in urban spaces, not all of them. They mostly lived in apartments, but for example, one was homeless and a couple was moving during lockdown, and moving with their cat was an awful experience. And so they have to relocate in a very small apartment. And so the shape of the apartment and the distribution of the rooms, the existence of a balcony or a terrace or a roof that they can use of course makes difference, especially for cats, because dogs can go outside. But usually they let their companion animals go everywhere in the house. They do not put restrictions. They modify the house if the house is unsafe, in order that their companion animals is allowed everywhere. But yes, the shape and the kind of apartment makes a big difference, and the class of the respondent also makes a difference. Because, for example, one of the that I also quoted in the presentation, one of them had the opportunity to move to the country side in their country villa, and they are, of course, are wealthy people, and so they didn't suffer the problem of being really locked up in lockdown as people living like in a one-room apartment. And these affected both the human and the non-humans, of course. Thank you.
Do I have time to jump in with the question, Corey, or?
Can you take your time, because Zoe's got frozen and knocked out. It's just to restart her computer.
Okay,
So ask
no,
the
right.
most complicated question you can come
I'll
up
go
with.
off on a rant then. Yeah, no, I was just, thanks for the talk. I was just wondering, you mentioned that idea of kind of people reflecting on animals, and it's bad to be locked up in a cage and that kind of thing. And I'm just wondering, in light of like Corey's research that saw a lot of potential for rethinking, but maybe it not happening on a wide scale, I just wonder your thoughts on sort of how widespread that sort of change in mindset occurred as a result of that unique experience of lockdown.
I'm kind of pessimistic about this point, because if asked, they tended to consider this, and most of them said we need to change our consumption patterns, try to be more environmentally respectful, try to buy local, for example. Something that was recurrent was this idea of changing shopping patterns and buying local. Because they also needed to do that, because the big distribution was somehow interrupted during the very first period of lockdown. So, but then they sort of didn't do the jump. They didn't link the fact that there was massive animal exploitation, and that this was a cause of the pandemic. In terms of causes, for example, I also investigated their perception of what causes the zoonotic pandemic, and not all of them mentioned zoonosis, even though it was discussed in media. And really, factory farming appeared really not very few times. And this never was accepted in the cases of people that were already vegan. Never led to the idea of I have to stop eating animals for the animals, but at least for the environments maybe, but not for the animals.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
All right, if there's not any more questions, actually, Delia in the chat says, I've always wondered how animals got on that often live on what we leave in cities, etc., such as foxes. Also, fewer roadkill to scavenge due to fewer cars. I know for me, definitely during lockdown, I was worried about all the pigeons that literally live off the tourists here in Canterbury. Like, what are they eating? I was feeding them here. I was feeding them here in my house, but
Yeah.
thousands and thousands of them. Yeah.
I went out every day here because there was a dog living. I live in a very small place near Palermo, and there was a dog living in the main square of this place that was completely alone because all the shops, the bars, the places were closed. And so I went out every day and feed her until she was adopted
So
by
happy
the
story.
vet of the place.
Oh.
So
Yeah, there's people from all over the world in the chat here sharing similar experiences. Zoe should be with us in a second. Her computer's back on. Don't see her in the room yet, though.
I think I'm here.
There you are.
there's
Hey.
a question.
Hey.
There's a question by Catherine about the idea, did participants respect the animal species needs as separate from the humans, or did they tend to humanize them to infantilism? No, I wouldn't say that. They try to respect their needs, and except some cases, they always distinguished between non-human needs and, for example, children needs, although of course they consider non-human animals as family, those living with them. So, but actually they respect them. They are very careful in this respect. Yeah. Okay.
Should we wrap it up and go on to move on to Zoe? There's so many things we could talk about with that. I was just also thinking, like, my dog is a lockdown dog. I wanted to adopt because my cat died during lockdown, and it was so difficult to do so. You had, because you couldn't go in person. All right, bye, lockdown puppy. She's playing with me. Okay, so are you ready?
I think so. I'll start sharing my screen if you are ready to go.
I'm just starting up trouble here. Okay.
Cross your fingers. I don't know why my computer's so angry today. Okay, can you see that?
Yeah, it looks good.
Excellent.
It's on the presenter view, though, I think.
Oh, I know. I don't want to make it any angrier. Can we just cope with presenter view?
I don't think anybody minds.
No, we'll live.
There it goes. That's good.
Okay, good. All right. Thank you for waiting for me and my very angry computer. Today I wanted to talk to you about spatialities of constraint, about resisting anthroparchy in the context of a housing crisis. And this is from a study that I did this year working with tenants who had companion animals and housing stakeholders about what makes it easier or harder to get, oh, that's going to be fun. What makes it easier or harder to get housing in the housing market. But this is building on studies that I did in my PhD, where I was looking at the socio-spatial construction of human companion animal relationships, which was really just a fancy way of saying that when we talk to people about their pet relationships, and I say pets in the way that we, I think we need to visualize the exploitation behind kind of breeding animals to sell their offspring to be used as companions for humans. But when we ask people about the companions that they share their lives with, often they will use the same language around things like family and very strong affective bonds. And they say things like, my cat rules the roost, or my dog's really in charge of our house, and, you know, I know my place in the pecking order. But when you go and actually look in people's houses, what you find is that they're very human controlled spaces. Humans do tend to be kind of the center of the way that they construct this. And you see this in the actual construction of space in the home space. And this is something that I think sociology is really well placed to address, because we know that home is a kind of private space that can be under human control. and the way that we choose to shape those home spaces can reflect those broader norms of anthroparchy. So we will see how far we get through that today. So I'm going to very quickly talk about the social construction of space in the home. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the project and the South Australian context that I'm from, and then talk a little bit about anthroparchy and capitalism, particularly when we're talking about a housing crisis context. So when we think about anthroparchy is a system of dominance where we see human wants and needs consistently privileged over other animals and the natural environment. And through our sociological kind of lens, we can see that these sorts of ideas are impregnated in the spaces that we actually live in. Spaces are socially produced, the way that we position things, the way that we rearrange furniture and we construct homes, and the way that we build on particular sites and use green space or don't use green space, move people on or don't move people on. All of this reflects and informs these kind of broader social relations about who we think we're housing and who we build these spaces to suit generally. And this means that some bodies move through home spaces a little more easily than others. And this isn't just non-human others, this can be humans as well. We often design houses around a very particular human body, and anyone else has a tougher time trying to work through them. So for non-human animals, the relations that are reproduced reflect these broader anthroparchal structures. And this is mostly cultures of exclusive humanism, where we see that animal space doesn't really get a mention in houses, and animals don't really get to exert very much control over the spaces in which they live if they are home spaces. Even though privacy and control in the home does enable other kinds of relationships, these ideas kind of make it tricky. So no, I'm going to go to the next slide. We'll talk about that. So technically in my home at the moment, I have the power and control to shape this so that I can sort of decenter human wants and needs to an extent. I can choose to privilege what my dogs like doing. I can make sure they have access to all the things that they need. But then I have to grapple with that idea of kind of human privilege and what it means to give up human privilege and what it actually looks like to live in a house where my wants and needs are kind of put last behind other animals. And these are really tough ideas to grapple with that I think are interesting sociologically, and also give us an insight into the challenge of what it actually means to try to push back on anthroparchy in everyday life. And that's something that I think is really important for vegan sociologists to try to understand, because it's in these everyday life spaces and in these tensions that we see these relationships really struggle, which is why we have anthroparchal norms in the first place. And we also see the consequences for animals when people don't push back on them. And on top of all of this, no matter how much I might like to think I live in this nice post-human household where my dogs have as much freedom as they possibly could have, you always have this threat of the anthropocentric outside, which is that they might have value in my house. I might think that they have value. I might construct them as minded, emotional beings. I might know very much for myself that they have value, they have wants, they have needs, and those needs should be respected. But as soon as they set foot outside of my house, essentially my dogs are reduced to a dollar value. They could be run over, they could be stolen, anyone could kind of hurt them, and there will be very little consequences for them. And that looming threat of the anthropocentric outside is the context that we also construct our houses in. It's always threatening to push in and affect the relationships that we can construct in them. But despite this, we can kind of look at houses as a space where we can shape them slightly around the way that animals like to do things. Animals can indeed demonstrate how they negotiate space and interactions. And we have a whole host of sociological and geographic works that have shown us how to do this. One of my favorite is Alga and Alga's social construction of cats in a free roaming cat shelter, where they did an ethnographic study looking at cat culture and how cats kind of develop their own social norms and their relations to space and the meanings in particular objects in places. And we can follow animals around and try to learn about what's meaningful to them if we really do that kind of close-up observation that Federica was talking about. So it's doable. We can definitely try to shape things around what animals like. But the way that we do this and the extent to which we accommodate animals' needs can really tell us something about power and relations in the home. And I've written on this before during on my PhD work with Nick Taylor, and that's a chapter in the Vegan Geographies book that you can look up if you wish. But there's all sorts of interesting examples of people accommodating animal space. I always remember I went to a house where someone was living with free living birds and two kind of working dogs, and they all kind of free roamed in the house, and they had constructed these amazing sort of spaces to make sure that birds had access to all of these different perching spots. They could relate freely if they wanted to. They had spaces they could go where they would be by themselves. And they found the birds were starting to create hybrid languages depending on how they each vocalized, and they would mimic noises in the house. And it was really interesting to see the way that when we accommodate animals' uses of space and what animals like to do in space, we can actually start to create these really imaginative and really wonderful multi-species relations, even in this broader anthropocentric concept. And one of the best examples, I think, of accommodating animal space comes from a Julianne Smith paper where she talks about this concept of rabbit space, where she was living with free living rabbits, and every day she would kind of set up the house and she would make it look tidy and she would make sure they had everything that they needed. And every afternoon she would come back and find that they completely destroyed the joint. There was stuff everywhere. There was stuff that was shredded. Everything was tipped over. There was like mess everywhere. And then after a while, she decided that instead of just cleaning it up and putting it down to, mess and animals kind of not really knowing what they're doing, she started looking at how they were starting to shape the space. And she found that there were patterns in the way that they were using space. They were keeping the perimeters of the rooms clear. They were making sure that there were spaces that they could go in so that they could observe things without being observed. They would position things in the center of the room so that there was kind of a hub that they would go in. And by starting to pay that really close attention, she got a really good understanding of what rabbit space looks like and how it could be accommodated. And then she shaped her house to suit that. And this is a really good example of ways that we can sort of accommodate for animal agency. And we can push back on that pressure to have human-centric norms in our homes in a perfect world. So this was the backdrop that I did my study in when I came in with very good intentions, thinking I was going to be looking at rental accommodation, seeing all of the ways that people navigate things with their houses. But as timing would kind of find it, I ended up doing a study about rental accommodation that fell right in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic in Australia, which, much like a lot of other countries, also coincided with the housing crisis. So my aim for this study was to talk to people who had successfully managed to get rental housing with their companion animals, talk to housing stakeholders, and try to find some ways that we could see what works and what could be improved when we're trying to house multi-species families. It was funded by the Society for Companion Animal Studies, and I worked with a partner organization, Safe Pets, Safe Families, who did a lot of the recruitment for us, particularly for the stakeholders, which was great. So it was a very simple study. We were really just trying to say, if you've lived somewhere like South Australia, and in the South Australian context, we know that we have kind of a third of households renting. We know that we have, that says 62%, but we have about 69% including companion animals after the pandemic. But we've seen this rapid increase in the average rent, a decrease in the available houses, and we don't have any sort of protective legislation. So around the world, we've started seeing some legislation come in to support kind of what they call pet-friendly tenancies. So moving that kind of the decision of whether or not people could have companion animals in their homes, so it was no longer at the landlord's discretion, and now tenants could apply to have a house with their companion animals, and landlords had to provide a really good reason why they couldn't. This was legislation that we're seeing get up in a bunch of places around the world, but South Australia, when it was put up for a vote in our parliament, we voted it down in 2021. So we have a really hostile legislative context, which means that we need to start to think of other ways that we can kind of successfully house multi-species families without relying on things like legislative protection or necessarily a good environment, because you can imagine that if we've voted down this kind of legislation, we don't necessarily have a non-hostile environment either. Oh, that's not helpful. Okay, so what I ended up doing is I did my interviews with 15 tenants and 10 stakeholders, and I was really just talking to them about what the context was that we were trying to negotiate housing in, what it was like to try to get a house if you're a multi-species family, and how you managed to stay in a house. And this is what a lot of the questions were about. But overwhelmingly, pretty much every interview I conducted started with people talking about the housing industry, how terrible the housing industry was. We don't have enough houses, rent has increased, it's unaffordable for a lot of people. And my interviewees were talking about the fact that, 10 or 15 years ago when they went to get a house, you might look through a house with maybe a couple of other people. And during the pandemic, you might go to a house where there were hundreds of other people lining up to go and look at a property. The competition was just incredible. And this really, really mattered for multi-species families, because it meant that there were kind of things that already existed. We already had sort of an attitudinal shift between tenants and landlords, which one person that I spoke to talked about how we have this idea that now renters are second-class citizens, and not just second-class citizens in the sense that you were seen to be poor because you couldn't afford a house, so you didn't have the right to live somewhere that you had control over, but also that this right was now being extended so that basically what she was saying is that if you're a tenant now, it's not just that you can't choose where you live or that you can't have access to housing. Now someone else gets to decide what your family looks like, because the housing market is so competitive that they can just say, you know what, we don't want you to have a dog, so you can just get rid of them. And this is something that people talked about again and again, not even just from landlords and rental managers, but that the whole market was so competitive that even service providers who were constructed to kind of help people get housing, particularly if you'd come from some sort of pathway through domestic violence or homelessness, even service providers were anti-companion animal and would just say, just get rid of your animal. Why would you keep your animal if it's going to stop you from getting a house? So this kind of really emphasized the disposability of non-human animals that already existed, but was definitely put on a hyperdrive because of this really intense situation that we're in. The housing scarcity and power inequality between landlords and property managers and the people that are renting houses also added pressure to conform to anthroparchal norms. And people talked about, you know, it's self-selected interviews. So usually when you talk to people, they've opted in because they're animal lovers. They want to talk to you about how they live with their companion animals. And they do a lot of things to try to make sure that their animals are happy in their houses. But because of the scarcity and the power inequality, the means that they had to do so were really restricted. So this was things like, people might really like to have their animals living inside with them. They might think that animals absolutely should be inside. There's no way that they should be outside. They shouldn't be subject to any kind of restriction. But in a housing crisis, if your choice is that you need to keep your animals under some sort of control, I don't know why it keeps doing that, the technology. You either need to keep your animals under some sort of control that subscribes to anthroparchal norms, or you can be homeless. All of a sudden, that's a very different choice. And choosing to be homeless with your companion animals can be really difficult, particularly going into the Australian summer when I was interviewing a lot of these people. So a lot of tenants were talking about things like accepting very broken houses. Some people fell through the floor and broke bones and things and still wouldn't complain about their housing because it was housing that they could get with their animal companions. People talked about being over-policed by tenants, by their landlords. So having people go through their wardrobes and comment on their clothing or make unwanted sexual advances. These are all things that people tolerated because they were in a house that would accept their animals. And on top of this, they got a lot of pressure to keep their animals in particular places, stop them from doing particular things. And stuff like, you know, not letting your animals play inside, not letting them have stuff around the place, not letting them vocalize, not having them in particular areas. Some people were afraid to let, you know, birds that were messy eaters had to have kind of tarps put up all around them to make sure that they didn't get stuff anywhere, because people were kept in this hyper-vigilant state of trying to minimize damage. And so I think here we see this really interesting and terrible intersection between anthroparchy and capitalism, which is, as soon as you say that housing can be an investment, it becomes a privilege, not a right, to live in a house. People talked about living in a house, and this was tenants who talked about living in a house, and they wouldn't say I live in a home or I live in the house. They would say I live in someone's investment and I have to keep it because it's someone's investment. And this really shifted the way that people think about their housing. And we see these kind of intersecting degradations around deciding who is worthy of living in safe and secure housing. So this could be animals. People talked about not wanting to have bully breeds or bigger dogs or cats or any animals that had any sort of challenging behavior in their homes. They also talked about stigmatized humans. People who came from domestic violence backgrounds or homelessness or single parents were also seen to be undesirable and not really worthy of housing. And stakeholders didn't say not worthy of housing, but it was that undertone of we wouldn't have anyone from these backgrounds who would live in these places. So we start to see these kind of reinforcing inequalities that affect both humans and other animals that make resistance really hard. Oh, I'm talking a bit long, I'll go a bit quicker. But this didn't mean that resistance didn't happen. And this is something that I found really interesting, that even under these really immense pressures, even under the threat of being homeless and being kicked out of their homes or having really bad rental references, which might mean future homelessness, some tenants did really resist the pressure to control or contain or dispose of their non-human animal companions to maintain their tenancies. And some of the things they did were creative home adaptations so that their animals could live well in a rental. So I spoke to cat owners who literally took their own carpet with them into whatever houses they went into. It was big rolls of carpet, and they would take their own floor with them to make sure that their cats could roam freely and not be accused of clawing any of the furniture or any of the carpet in the places that they lived. Some people would take the doors off in the houses that they moved into so they could install doors with doggy doors and things like that, and then take them off and put them back on before they left. People would go to extreme lengths to do their own maintenance to make sure that there was never any damage seen anywhere. Some people created their own sort of access so that animals could have inside-outside access through windows, through anything that they could make that meant that animals had free access in the houses. And they also stood up for themselves. So when people came to accuse them of creating damage, of their animals not behaving in a way that was appropriate, they would stand up for themselves and they would fight back. And some of them used official means like tribunals to successfully fight back on these kinds of unfair treatment. Some people would even move their entire lives rather than rehoming their non-human animals. So I spoke to someone who moved from town to town to town and uprooted their whole life, their job, their children, their everything, just to find somewhere that they could live with their non-human companions. So people did really go to extreme lengths to try to push back on this idea that their companion animals were disposable, that they didn't deserve to live well in their homes. But these had really negative consequences for the humans. So it could mean that they were seen as choosing periods of homelessness rather than separating from their animal companions. And choosing is a very problematic word there, I think. But so people would live in their car, they would live in tents because that was the option that they had rather than separating from their animal companions. Not everyone can make that choice. If you had children, you can't be seen to refuse housing because it's not animal-friendly housing. Otherwise, you get a flag put on you for child protection. So in that instance, you can't even choose to be homeless with your pets, but some people would try to do that. Other people had to have the money to make these kinds of choices. So you can imagine if you're doing your own maintenance and things like that, or you're accepting these consequences, why must you do that? Some people had a level of financial security. To be able to buy a whole house worth of carpet to take with you, you need to have enough money to do that sort of thing. So these are very class things that people were doing. But you start to see these really clear intersections between the difficult conditions that humans are experiencing and those that are affecting their animal companions as well. But I guess the question is, why is rental accommodation an issue for vegan sociology that is primarily concerned with animal exploitation? And I think for me, it's definitely a question for vegan sociology, partially because, you know, these are systems of dominance that intersect and shape the social world that we live in. I think this is a really good example where you see that anthroparchy intersects with capitalism in a way that impacts on human and non-human lives in really problematic ways. And we need to be pushing back on that for humans and non-humans at the same time. It needs to be kind of not just a single focus. We need to be pushing back on all of these things. And even though ultimately pet ownership is an exploitative practice, I certainly wouldn't be advocating for breeding. I wouldn't be advocating for future pet ownership, but we have non-human animals who are alive and living in these relationships now. And for them, the material conditions that they live in do matter, and understanding the challenges that might encourage us to be more or less anthroparchal in our home spaces can help us to sort of try to push back on these things in everyday life, which I think is good. And sociology is really well placed to examine the relationships between these broader structural issues in everyday life. And I think this is a really important point because at the moment we're talking about legislative change, which is that legislation I told you about, which shifts things so that it's not at the landlord's discretion that people can have companion animals in their homes. It's something that tenants can have as a default that needs to be justified if landlords want to deny them. But this is a very intense focus on legislative change that I think ignores a lot of the attitudinal problems that are behind a lot of this, which is the attitudes towards animals, the fact that we feel that animals are not deserving of safe homes, that we have attitudes towards particular species, that we don't consider them worthy of consideration, that companion animals have these sort of liminal spaces where you might be considered a pet and privileged now, but that can be taken away from you tomorrow, and then you're a killable animal that doesn't really have any value. So sociology is very well placed to look at all of these things. So I think we should as vegan sociologists. And I also think the home is a really interesting space for us to be working in. I know Erica Cudworth and Stephen Hobden talk about those sites of everyday fucking up of the capitalist scene in their emancipatory posthumanism book. And I think the home is a space where we can do that everyday fucking up. If you've got private space where you can reimagine your relationships with other animals, that's something really important that can be doing really good work to move towards sort of emancipatory vegan futures. And if we have these capitalist spaces that are encouraging us to be more anthroparchal, less likely to be following what animals could be doing, less likely to reimagine our relationships because it is really hard and it has really hard consequences for people, then that's a problem. That's a barrier to a vegan future that I would like to see. So I think it's important to think about the home as a space that we should take very seriously, and the fact that it is a site of really immense promise, unless it is very precarious accommodation, in which case, you know, we really need to be addressing this as a vegan sociology issue. Anyway, I'll leave it there. I feel like I've probably spoken too much and you've put up with me fighting with my PowerPoint presentation. So thank you for that.
We have a lot of activity in the chat because this, I think, hits home for a lot of people. It's like not just for people in housing crises. Like I know when I moved here from the United States, even the United States is really bad about having places that are dog and cat friendly. But the place I'm living in now, I've lived here since I moved here. It's the only place I could find within my price range that allowed dogs and cats, or cats rather. Mishka is kind of a mystery if she's allowed here or not. I just don't tell them. So it's significantly, this is why sociologists matter, significantly shapes, as you pointed out, the shape of our family and also where we live and like quality of life. All comes down to my dogs and my cats. And I know there's people in the chat who have had similar experiences with that. And another kind of thing that I don't think was, there's two things I wanted to point out before I hand it over to other people was here in the UK, there's recent legislation change where you have to have good grounds to prevent people from having dogs and cats now. It's still, the law seems a little bit, I feel like the landlord could easily come up with something. That's just like, even today, like if someone comes over to do maintenance work, I make sure I take the whole day. It's like a huge inconvenience for me when they come over just to do the slightest, oh, we're going to check your smoke alarms. That means I have to negotiate my whole day to like hide my dog because I don't know if my dog is allowed. I'm not risking it, right? And the other thing is also with cats. In the United States, when I adopted my cats there's a big movement to keep cats indoors because of the damage done to free living animals. But here in the UK, it's a complete opposite. I went through multiple charities trying to adopt a cat. They wouldn't let me do it because I said, I live in city center and I'm not going to let my cat free roam. And they feel like that's, so again, they're kind of forcing the shape of my family based on their beliefs about what space should be accessible to animals. I mean, my cat does go out in the garden, but I don't let her just like ramble the streets. By the way, I brought this up at the last conference last year and someone emailed me, I think it was Erica did. And I now have a cat. Like right after the conference, that I was put in touch with someone and I found a rescue that was a little bit more in line with my predicament as far as letting my cat outside. So I guess what I'll do now, Zoe, and I mean, unless you have any feedback on what I just said, I'm going to go back through some of these comments.
I don't think so. I really want to meet your cat now, though.
I don't know where she is. I think she's downstairs. Yeah. Because one of my cats, both my cats died during COVID. One of them died during the heat of, I'm scrolling back, the heat of lockdown. And it was just really important for me not to have an empty home with like, okay, geez, people are very chatty about this. A lot of rabbit folks in here. Okay. All right. Josephine says certain people coming into our homes also threaten attempts toward post-human homes, reimposing norms, resisting our arrangements for multi-species thriving. Nick also contributes here, says running your house in a way that works for companion animals is often criticized by visitors because it's not normal. A friend of mine's cat liked drinking water out of a glass, but parents didn't like that idea. My cat drinks where my cat wants to drink, I'm saying. Delia says, yes, due to bitter experience with computer leads and telephone wires, used to warn friends, anything on the floor is fair game. Sorry, I'm just looking for questions in here. People are just kind of contributing here. Kadri says, I used to have a local cats and dogs sanctuary at home, the only one we had on the island. So I know what you're talking about. And they still have 6 cats behaving problems. Still have 6 cats with behaving problems living there, not normal at all. All right, here you go. Josephine says, language interests me, but the problematic person term for me. Humans overall are being so violent and destructive towards species and the environment. So yeah, this language of personhood is in there. I don't know if any of this is striking you. Does anyone have any like questions? Comments? Would you like to jump in?
I'm just scrolling through the questions.
So many people went off. Federica says, having rented a house in lockdown, I can confirm it wasn't easy to find one accepting non-humans. I had to balance cost and size because there's 3 cats. I needed to protect the sofa, the bed, they're always there. That's why I have all the stuff covering my furniture. It's not my furniture, it's all rented furniture. And I definitely got the snarky comment when I came in with the cats, because they had to make a special exception just for me to have the cats. Otherwise, like, I wouldn't have been able to take the job here. It was that was that bad finding housing here. And the landlord was like, well, I mean, we'll make an exception, you know. So, well, my cats don't really scratch. They said, well, they all say that. Just like, it's just like they had to belittle you while they're also taking money from me for this piece of land. It's like, you're not even, what worth are you adding? You're just exploiting profit from people. Sorry. Erica, would you like to ask a question while we're all ranting?
Oh, sorry, this is more of a comment than a question,
Go
but
for
it's
it.
kind of it's really frustrating that sociology hasn't taken home as seriously as it should have done for so long. Somehow, because it's seen as a space issue, it's geography that's paid far more attention to it, particularly feminist geography. And I can see an edited book just in the chat comments, really, in terms of everybody's experiences, because when we think of our private spaces of home, they are spaces where we can eat differently, cook differently, you know, have different furniture, as well as having relationships with other species that inhabit our space. So there's kind of, you know, I think it's a really kind of rich area for us to think about. So sorry, that wasn't a question. I really enjoyed these papers, by the way. Thanks.
I have a question for people, if that's okay. Can I just hijack my own question time? Well, I feel like I'm half hosting, so yes, I'm deciding I can hijack my question time. I'm really interested in, I spoke to a few people who had older dogs, and some of the things that they talked about were that as animals get older, it's sort of less acceptable to have them in the house. And I thought this is really interesting because I mean, I know that we negate kind of animals have any kind of mindedness or personhood or needs or wants or anything like that. But there's also that, you know, that discussion around that you never see older animals, and that animals don't get to be old, they don't get to be frail, they don't get to have any kind of health needs, they don't get to have kind of anything. And I thought this was just another extension where I keep seeing this discourse of good tenants, which is definitely that disgusting categorization of humans that is race and class, right, Erica? But also of good dogs and good pets. I see this discourse of people saying, well, you know, good animals can stay in homes and they won't ruin it, but those bad animals will ruin it for everyone. And I think, well, what's a bad animal? Do you not get to have health challenges? Do you not get to have kind of trauma from your past? And it all just kind of denies animals a complexity as well. So I wondered if anyone had anything about of aging animals or animals with disabilities that also factor into housing, or is that too specific? You can mull it in the chat. I'm just curious.
I know one of my best friends that her family put their dog down because he was getting put them down because he was getting older and just like peeing everywhere. And they read that as this is a poor quality of life, but I wonder so much if a lot of it was actually they're just tired of cleaning it up.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was years ago, and it still sticks with me because it upset me then and it upsets me now.
Oh, I think Federica has her hand up, and I know there's some questions now. I'll stop talking. Sorry.
Yeah, it was something that Erica wrote in the chat. I'm curious about it as well. Does something change in terms of people looking for a house in terms of class, race, and gender? Did you note any difference about this?
Yeah, absolutely. So where to start? Class, definitely, because the first thing people talk about is affordability, and affordability is partially about money. People look at income, but they also talk about, you know, when landlords or rental managers have a look at who wants to live in their house, they look at things like those social elements of class. They might say, you know, you look at how they're dressed and you look at the car that they came in or their keys and things like that, or, you know, you look at how they're speaking when they're coming through the house. And I thought all of these are kind of class markers that aren't just about how much money someone has, it's about those social elements of class and desirability and who you want living in your home. And particularly, there were kind of levels of class that if you were seen to have been homeless, you were just not offered any housing lists to look at. So people talked about not even being able to find houses to rent because they couldn't actually access the ads for them unless they found somewhere to go online and look at them, because if they went into a housing office and they suspected they were homeless, you would not even get to look at them. Gender elements came in particularly with single mothers. There was a lot of stigma around single mothers that again was framed as affordability, but didn't necessarily seem like it was tied to income. It seemed like it was tied to a stigma around gender because people said single mothers. They didn't say people of a certain income bracket. And particularly in terms of race, in this project, not so much, but last year I was working on a few different housing projects around social housing and housing overcrowding and Indigenous tenancies. And absolutely, there's a whole level of kind of intense racism in rental accommodation, and particularly rental accommodation applications that ask you to put a photo on, which puts people in a really difficult position for, you know, especially stigma against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians, that you either have to put a photo on, people can see you're Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, and that invokes kind of all sorts of stigma if you get the wrong person looking at your application, or you don't put a photo on and then you don't get a look in because you didn't put a photo on. So there's a whole lot of different things around that, and the connotations around particular racial groups and racial stereotypes that definitely factor in as well. So yes to all of those things. Housing research is really depressing. Oh, kidney failure, Erica. I'm glad it's not just me. That is my house exactly right now. And whenever I do these interviews, I just think, wow, is everyone doing as much cleaning as me? Because I don't think any landlord would pass me on any inspection with my older dogs.
So there's a couple of questions I picked out for you and put them in your WhatsApp chat because there's people so chatty with this particular topic to pick them out for you.
Maria, the housing movement is pretty big. How can we reach out to the housing movement? What do you see as the housing movement? Is this kind of like a resistance movement challenging the housing situation?
Sorry, I was thinking of the housing movement in Romania, but I know it's also big like in Germany and I suppose other countries. About the housing rights, yes, and access to more decent housing, rent caps, how are they called? Stuff like that, yeah.
Yeah. I see Nick's just mentioned campaigns for public housing in Melbourne. We certainly have discussions around public housing in Australia generally, and the Australian Greens, I think, talk a lot about public housing. For companion animal housing specifically, we're starting to see a few different things pop up internationally. So I just had a meeting with the Scottish SPCA last week, who are launching a tenants and pets kind of initiative to try to encourage more multi-species housing and speak directly to landlords and property managers and work with tenants to try to get some movement in that very specific space. And they're intersecting with kind of domestic violence and homelessness services there. So if you want to talk to people about Scottish situation, I can certainly link you in with them. But other than that, yes, the Greens have been very good on the issue. Other than that, I don't know anything off the top of my head, I'm sorry, but I can certainly look it up if you email me and remind me. And Catherine, have I thought of looking it up and typing it to housing authorities to highlight the discrimination? Yes, I'm writing it up at the minute. I should have written it up by now, but it has been subsumed by marking. The marking has killed it. It's getting written up at the moment, and we're working with some stakeholders who hopefully will get it into the hands of different policymakers, and we've had some interest from a few different key bodies, so hopefully we will get some traction. And I know there's a lot of interest in writing a parliamentary submission in South Australia, where they have rejected the legislation here already. So yes, hopefully soon. Teaching's nearly finished. Yay.